Jason Pack is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute and the founder of Libya-Analysis LLC. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Spectator, Financial Times, Foreign Affairs. In this is another one, and I love this as a Greek. In 2008, he won the World Championship of doubles backgammon, and he's the author of Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Pleasure, and important to point out that I did play a Greek team in the finals of the World Championship of Backgammon, and I was interviewed by Greek Vice News, and it was a very, very funny experience, coffee housing and getting into that comedy with these Greeks.
I will have to go check that out. That's a whole other topic for another time, but definitely grew up playing backgammon with my grandfather.
Nice, and I like as we get into the incumbent psychology of the power holders that we need to understand, I think games like backgammon and poker really can give us an insight into why people don't want to solve collective action problems and get out of the way of their own egos. So you can jump into it however you want to.
All right, so let's just start off with oh man, there's a lot of misinformation about Libya, and I specifically use misinformation because anytime I mention Libya on the show, I get lots of weird responses from people online, and I'm not sure how much of it is actually coming from folks who don't have malintentions, and that I think is a reflection of the geopolitical world that we live in today, where there are lots of tools being used to disrupt democracy, disrupt organizing, propaganda, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I'll just start off with what happened in Libya briefly. What happened in Libya in 2011? Of course, this was under the Obama administration. What happened, and why? Just free flow. Like, why was that kind of the marking point?
Sure. I don't like to focus just on 2011, but when you said that Libya is the first petri dish of the global enduring disorder, I want to make clear for your listeners and watchers, I argue that we are no longer in the post-Cold War world. We are in the post-Cold War world. And this new world doesn't have the certitudes either of the bipolar universe of the Cold War or the American hegemony of the early post-Cold War period. And it's not that Libya was the key changing moment, the dynamics that unfolded there, but rather the dynamics that we now all are familiar with first began to exhibit themselves in the way in which the Libya regime change and NATO no-fly zone, I don't believe it's an intervention, but the no-fly zone unfolded because it was not led by a coherent Western bloc, nor was it led by a coherent group of actors on the ground in Libya. Coordination failures meant that a suboptimal outcome came about. And that's really, really different than what happened in Iraq or Afghanistan. Right. I want to stress that what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan was the wrong decisions being made in the Pentagon and Foggy Bottom and intervened and imposed on, another country and all the blowback that came from that. However, the Libya failure is not that. No decisions that were coherent were made in Whitehall, Foggy Bottom, and the Pentagon or at the UN. Rather, you had a new coordination failure between the French pulling in one direction, the Italians in another, the Qataris and the Emiratis fighting it out in Libya. And then this led to the first Libyan Civil War in 2014-15, where the country bifurcates in two prime ministers, two governments, and really zero government. Then another civil war in 2019-2020, frequently called the Second Libyan Civil War or the War for Tripoli. And now, again, just as of last week, we're in a situation with two prime ministers again. And who is even recognized by the UN is unclear. And this kind of enduring disorder, Nomiki, this is extremely different than what we have seen in the Cold War and post-Cold War periods. I just want to toss it out there that it would have been impossible if Gaddafi died or was overthrown in the 1980s, that in the civil war that would ensue, the French and Italians were on opposite sides. It was not something that we would ever have allowed to happen. So that is an example of how fundamentally different the global enduring disorder is from the previous geopolitical realities that preceded it.
So going back to 2011, it's been it's been 12 years now, hard to believe, or it's 11 years. When the this is obviously the Arab Spring, and Libya was in a little bit of a different situation than Tunisia and Egypt. Can we just focus on this for a second so folks can understand why the conditions were unique? What was happening in Libya? Why did things go in a different direction? And of course, can you explain the NATO no-fly zone too, just for folks to understand that?
Sure. I mean, roughly put, first in Tunisia, then in Egypt, a series of popular uprisings erupted largely over economic conditions and unemployment against neoliberal economic policies in Egypt and Tunisia that had led to certain kinds of unemployment and greater stratification. Mm-hmm. They were successful because the regimes backed down without using the most amount of military force to repress the protesters. In Libya, the uprising came about for a different reason. They weren't protesting against neoliberal reforms because those had never come to Libya. Rather, they were protesting against the very nature of the Gaddafi regime, whose perestroika and glasnost opened them up to the internet and the wider world, and they saw essentially how cut off they had been. They wished to join the international community.
That was for a couple of years under his son, right? His son was in charge of, modernizing, opening up.
I mean, I would contest that. I think you're referring to Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, yes. But no, rather the détente of 2003, 2010 opened Libya up to the West in a certain way. But again, let's not get sidetracked. So yes, in 2011, you had a series of multipolar uprisings. You had an uprising of civil society activists. You had an uprising of Islamists. You had a different uprising in Misrata than you had in Benghazi. What happened is that the Gaddafi regime went all in on the old tactics, fire into the crowd and, pull a Hama a la 1982 in Syria. And that doesn't work anymore because with social media, people get aware to what's going on, that even the Arab League, for the first time in its history, asked for non-Arab powers to intervene with a no-fly zone in an Arab state. And then you had UN resolutions 1970 and 1973, but these were not led in a coherent way. You had the French pulling in one direction, the British in another, Sarkozy acting for domestic political reasons, right, and no American leadership. Because of that lack of American leadership, we just end up with an extremely different situation, right, than in previous interventions and no-fly zones and things like this, so that the reconstruction phase was botched, not because of too much reconstruction or imposed nation building a la Iraq or Afghanistan, but too little reconstruction, not enough coordination, and allowing every different tiny power from Qatar to Turkey to the Emirates to Russia and Egypt to back different militias, and essentially many powers benefiting from using Libya to promote more global disorder, right? And this is, again, a difference, which is that this desire to promote more global disorder is the key feature of what I consider our new era. And it begins to play out in Libya because migrants through Libya are crucial.
But let's get to that. You guys are going to break it down and say, so back on the ground in Libya, right? In 2011, weapons facilities were being targeted. Gaddafi was killed, blah, blah. And then suddenly you have many different factions, tribes, brothers and cousins who have access to weapons, and no organized, like nobody was there to organize a military to make sure that this oil-rich state could. I mean, how do they? Unlike Iraq, like you said, where there was overinvestment in that, why didn't Obama and the U.S. say, well, at least we can do is go in there and train Libyans, at least early on?
Well, generals always fight the last war, particularly because Obama promised to not do W. Bush style imposed nation building. He then made the opposite mistake, and he admitted that it was his greatest foreign policy mistake of not leading the allies and really trying what he thought was to have a soft touch. But the Libyans asked for more capacity building assistance, and we didn't deliver it. And even more importantly than that, we didn't try to set the rules of the game so that when the political isolation law happened in April, May 2013, and that was like de-Baathification or lustration, but in the Libyan context. Well, we're like, well, we saw de-Baathification, what played out in Iraq, but, we're not going to, pick a side. The Libyans can just do whatever they want, but they weren't really doing that. They were being pushed by Turkey and Qatar and certain kinds of Islamists who wanted to purge even technocrats who had any Gaddafi regime connections, so much so that the prime minister at the time had to resign because he had been an ambassador to India. It made no sense. And we didn't impose any rules of the game. And in fact, to make this clear for your audience, I see a direct line between the events in Libya and Syria and Brexit and Trump. If there's no implosion of the Syrian and Libyan states, it's impossible to imagine a world in which there's Brexit or the election of Trump, because it was the migration issue in the UK, which really the fears of hordes of migrants, which allows that kind of neo-populism to culminate in Brexit. And then in America, without the death of my very close friend, Ambassador Chris Stevens in Benghazi on September 12th, 2012, you can't see the rise of neo-populists on the right, because Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney are too polite to use the death of an American ambassador to get to chance of lock her up. And it was this desire to create more chaos to then benefit from that chaos electorally that unites the Brexiteers and Trump. And this new era of global enduring disorder is the rise of this neo-populist phenomenon from Orban all the way through to Trump that we can't see on the international stage, except for the disorder that Libya, Syria, and Ukraine inject in the global system.
So was the Arab Spring and really the effects of Libya the beginning of tensions with NATO, within NATO?
Well, we've always had a problem with the Turks' role inside NATO, but you're correct in pointing out that the Arab Spring polarized different factions within NATO. But
why? What was the holdup?
Well, because American leadership was not something that Obama really cared to do. And when he set the red line in Syria, which is a little after the events of the Arab Spring in Libya, and then we didn't enforce that red line in 2012, 2013, this led directly to Putin's seizure of Crimea after the Olympics in 2014, and we had no unified NATO response. That signaled to other medium powers inside NATO, oh, there isn't going to be a unified NATO response. We can go for our own peculiar interests without coordinating with the other NATO allies. And yes, that fissure is something that I blame Obama for. And without it, it couldn't be that the French would go against Western policy and back General Haftar because they have a desire to be the leaders of the Maghreb, of North Africa.
And who is General Haftar, for folks who aren't familiar?
The rogue General Khalifa Haftar had been a CIA asset in the 1980s, but then he, as a megalomaniac, established himself as the nominal coup leader of attempts to overthrow the UN-backed government in Libya, and has had multiple coups where he claims to be the leader of Libya. He obviously isn't the sole leader of Libya, that culminated in his attempt to take Tripoli by force from April 4th, 2019 to June 2020. And although the UN recognized government was under attack and all Western countries pretty much were required to defend it, the French sided with Haftar, covertly, of course.
Why?
While the Italians sided with the UN-backed government as their most important Western supporter. So this shows you how much the world has changed, that in a hot civil war, you can have French-trained and Italian-trained troops opposite sides of the same civil war.
But why was France doing that? I mean, now you see
okay, this is
Macron.
easily explainable, Nomiki. People in America forget that they are going through what Florence Gaub calls their George W. Bush moment. They had the Bataclan terrorist attack. They had the Charlie Hebdo attack. And both Hollande, despite being on the left domestically, and now Macron being arguably on the center right, are going through a W. Bush moment. They're projecting power into Mali. They're doing every kind of covert counter-terror stuff abroad. And they wish to be the counter-terror player, primarily in North Africa, but even in the Middle East. So because of this this Francis W. Bush moment. Aha, Haftar can be our vehicle through which to project French power as being a French mini hegemon through a kind of Gaullist foreign policy approach. So they're very happy to thumb their nose at NATO and the EU, just as General de Gaulle tried to thumb his nose at NATO on many occasions. So it's for this reason that if they can be leaders, they want to lead on the Libya file. They don't care that they're screwing other NATO allies. And this never could have gotten to this level if we had an appropriate amount of American leadership as existed in the Cold War or post-Cold War periods. And it highlights, as I pointed out, the extent to which we're in the global enduring disorder.
I want to rewind just a little bit and talk about the role of ISIS and this is again an oil-rich state. It's for folks listening different than Egypt, for instance, or Tunisia, which makes it very geopolitically sexy, I guess, is a way of saying it. So ISIS didn't really have an existence, weren't they? They were pushed out, or some extremist forces were pushed out by Gaddafi, and then the fall of Gaddafi created an opening. Not having a military, for instance, created an opening.
Well, obviously, there was no ISIS during the Gaddafi period, but you could say that in Libya, more traditional or conservative forms of Islam have always predominated, whether it was the Senussi Sufi order in the east or the more traditional Maliki versions of Islam throughout Libya. There's no tradition of anything approaching Salafi, Hanbali, Wahhabi Islam in Libya. It's always been an external force. About 200 or 300 fighters had come back into Libya from Afghanistan and Iraq, and they did make a nucleus of jihadi fighters who participated in the attacks against Gaddafi through the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, or the Muqatila. And yes, there was a base in Derna of these Islamists in 2012-13. But unfortunately, because we didn't have our eyes on the prize, we in the West and in neighboring states kind of radicalized the situation by backing one group against the other in Libya, and then getting very, very short-sighted in attempts to push ISIS out of Mosul and Raqqa, and looking at what was going on in Libya as, oh, it's just a counter-terror issue if we can just push ISIS out of Sirte, who was first in Derna in 2014-15, and then had its third largest base globally in Sirte in 2015-16. You know, just the short-sightedness of the global enduring disorder is, oh, if we can, push them out of Sirte, we don't need to defeat them as a force. And that's why they were able to take refuge in the southern desert. And you are seeing a resurgence of more ISIS attacks recently. There was no coordinated effort to use the fact that 99% of the Libyan people obviously oppose any form of jihadism, and 99.9% oppose ISIS. So we could have used that as a unifying force to help create Libyan institutions. And it's really important to point out that Libya is one of these few places in the US where America is extremely, extremely popular. There were polls in 2012 where Libya topped Canada as having the most favorable impressions of the United States, right? So they're always crying out for us to be more involved in helping build the electricity grid, getting, their oil infrastructure up and running, but also working with the various militias to make a national army and do the SSR and DDR that's needed to keep jihadis out.
So for those who see America as this imperialist country that, where were those polls coming from? I've been on the ground and I've witnessed it myself and felt it. And I was quite surprised, having worked in a lot of places around the world, and friendlier, what I would assume were friendlier places to the US, and seeing the gratitude for information, for especially among young people. So why is that? Why is the US, based on these polls, more popular?
I mean, the history of Libya in the United States is a long and complex one. I'll try to summarize, which is that the British and Americans liberated Libya from the most brutal colonialism of fascist Italy, probably the most brutal colonialism in human history. And then we supported the Senussi monarchy, where the US not only had military bases, but was fundamental in building the Libyan oil infrastructure. And then we were the ones who were hard on Gaddafi. And many Libyans are really happy that the US, Reagan, and others stood up to Gaddafi and sanctioned him. So that's an important background. But then in 2011, we didn't do any high-handed nation building. And yes, some Libyans are happy that it wasn't kind of imposed capacity building assistance, but many others wanted to have more American-led assistance, or at least setting the rules of the game for what constituted legitimate Libyan authority. And it's important to look at the fact that Libya is a very different kind of state than Iraq or Afghanistan. Libya is a state that's created by the UN. It's the first state ever created by the UN, and it has a unique relationship to the international community. You could say that Libya's sovereignty is not unconditional the way that other sovereignties are unconditional. It is a sovereignty that emerges from the UN process led by Adrian Van Pelt from 1949 to 1951. So after 2011, Libya again found itself in a situation where its sovereignty is mediated through international institutions. And Libyans would be happier if America was willing to lend an extra hand to make sure that that inherent international sovereignty was exercised reasonably, rather than being fought back and forth in a tug of war with Turkey and Qatar on one side and the Emirates, France, and Russia on the other side. The Libyans don't enjoy that they are a petri dish where these new global disordered fights are playing out.
So now that we are in this, we see it playing out, and I can see, based on your writing, how much changed since then. What is, I know it's not easy to say in 5 minutes, but what is a solution? How, especially given Putin's, flexing his muscles and at least in a symbolic way partnering with Xi Jinping, and Bannon building a team of allies from Erdogan to Putin to every single bad actor you can think of. How do we get out of this with NATO cracking?
Yeah, I have to say, I wouldn't put my money on things getting better before they get a lot worse. That said, I'm happy to be moving more towards solutions. I've been appointed a senior analyst at the NATO Foundation in Rome, and I'll be having my own podcast working on solutions. I think we need a new kind of coalition or leadership. There isn't going to be an American hegemony, and calling for it makes no sense. There isn't going to be a traditional Western alliance run by NATO, but we can see maybe an alliance where people care about things like climate change and tax havens and the increasing inequality of the global system, and wish to see consensus leadership. That consensus leadership has not been called for. I see, maybe differently than many listeners to this show, I see identity politics and wokeness as detracting from the real threats that we have. And the way to deal with these things is a bottom-up mass movement focusing on only the big picture. We can't be fighting small battles, for me, about school boards and mask mandates or anti-vaxxers.
I don't think people on our show is fighting that at all. I think that they're thinking about unionizing and organizing and really playing the big picture and fighting the bad guys.
So for my analysis, we need to have a coalition of the major states and people buying in, saying, I care about foreign policy a lot more than domestic policy, and I care about the future and the future of my children more than some ideological or emotional issues that have identity resonance for me right now. And it's probably going to get a lot worse, because that's not the way that we're going in our increasingly fractured politics in the US and UK. And if we have these two tribes, be they called Remain and Leave or Democrat and Republican, it seems difficult to me at this moment to get the kind of bipartisanship which is needed to stand up to this neo-populist threat. which, as you pointed out, is not a solution to anything. In fact, Bannon admits that he is a great disruptor.
Chaos agent, yeah.
Because Putin and Xi and Erdogan and Orban offer no alternative order. Their order is great. Let's break it so there's more disorder and more migrants and proliferation of arms, so that then the world is a scarier place and easier for us to operate in. And that is unfortunately where we're at now. So we need to be working with our allies. And it pains me to see Biden and Boris Johnson bring the US-UK relationship to the lowest point that it has been since World War I. That is it's just a tragedy where we're at now.
Agreed. And I think we actually have more that I think the progressive movement, the real progressive movement, those who are focused on solidarity and actions and organizing are very cognizant of this. And, I think there are a lot of folks who are there to disrupt on our side as well, and distract and bring chaos, because you say things that the far right is doing, and a lot of these bad actors, whether world leaders or Bannon, they're never offering solutions.
Correct.
The same thing is happening with chaos agents who are acting on the left, complaining about American imperialism, but never talking about other powers or the dynamics that occur on the ground. They don't talk about, they complain about mandates and vaccines and being canceled, but they never talk about solutions to a lot of these problems. So I really appreciate this. I'm about a third of the way through the book, but I did just get it. But I'm going on vacation for 2 weeks, so I'll bring a lovely copy with me, and maybe we'll have you back soon to talk more about your podcast and the solutions.
I'd love that. I think your listeners and you would really like what I talk about in chapter 5, which is the way in which Fortune 500 companies no longer try to maximize their bottom lines or have the quarterly earnings increased. They've become arch incumbents, from Facebook to ExxonMobil to Deutsche Bank. I had thought, they want to do more business in Libya and make more money.
Yeah.
But no, they don't. They want to stay in power. And that is the tragedy of incumbency that we're now seeing play out globally, which is that if you're in this kind of C-suite position, okay, let's just block new entrants.
Right.
And this is more complicated than a kind of Rachel Maddow blowout view, which is that, well, ExxonMobil, it's corrupt. They bribe officials in Equatorial Guinea to produce more barrels. I don't like that either, but that at least purports a desire to maximize profits.
That's right.
I'm saying they don't have to bribe any officials. They don't do anything illegal. They don't even want to necessarily produce more barrels in Libya. They just want to fight change and progress, because then it's a world where they're not necessarily in the leading industry or the leading player in that industry. Okay, we can just freeze things as they are because we have the WhatsApp number of the central bank governor, and occasionally he pays us. We don't even care that our payments come late. And that experience that I had, I think, really resonates with some of the things you talk about in episodes I've listened to, which is that there's so much dysfunction in corporate America. We can't even use the traditional means to describe that dysfunction, which is about, they're trying to maximize profits. No, it's much worse than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Really fascinating. Check out the book. We'll have the link up there. Jason Pack, really appreciate it. If you aren't already, join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show and become a patron. That's how we do this. We may not always get along, but it's really important to support independent media. In the meantime, stay in solidarity.